Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I believe I'm going to share my screen. I am. We're going to give folks a chance to get in the room here. While they're doing that, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Let's see. Judy, are you in here with me? Not yet. Okay. All right, we'll give folks just a minute to join us. All right. So, guess I will start with, can you all see my screen? What we want you to consider as you're doing this work is when deciding which of whether it's E1 or E2, how does this impact the boundaries and what are the impacts for Black and Native students and English language learners, right? So let us know. And Judy, if you wouldn't mind being our note taker as you normally do, we are ready to start that discussion with someone. Well, if you want, you can raise your hand and we can get you into the conversation. Okay, anyone have any thoughts to share? No, I think you're weighing in at both at the same time. So you're kind of right now, what we're trying to do is have conversations that will allow us to talk about which of these, because the hope would be at the end of these, we can make a recommendation to the entire SEGC about the direction that we want to go. Eddie, your hand is up.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so my my question is about actually it's a question, not really criteria, but so with E1, Kellogg is projected to be pretty over enrolled. And so two questions come from that. Like, what is the equity impact of being in a school that's over enrolled? Because I know as a teacher in an over enrolled school, it was not fun. And second, the other issue is in terms of the long-term impact, like, does that mean that we would have to, because Jed said there wasn't much flexibility in trying to move students around. So does that mean that in the long run, the Spanish immersion programs would have to shrink? Like, I'm just, my question is like, what are some possible solutions to solve the over enrollment issue? Thanks.
I don't want to speak out of turn here, Judy, so you tell me if I'm incorrect, but I believe those are some of the things that they're tackling in the boundaries group, right? Because the only way that you're able to do that likely with Spanish DLI at Kellogg is to adjust boundaries and feeder patterns. Is that right, Judy?
And yeah, I think those are great points. I would say that there is flexibility. It's just additional work that hasn't been put on the table yet. So if 4 strands of Spanish immersion will be anchored in that school, and you want to look to reduce enrollment, it's looking at the boundaries, which is the focus for the rest of this meeting and the next one, or any other whole feeder schools.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts? Again, trying to keep Oscar.
Yeah, I think it'd be great if we could get to a point where we could establish some guardrails in the sense of saying that, like, yes, we want to keep Spanish DLI at Kellogg, and how do we work around that, right? Like, once we commit to something, we could work around that as opposed to start looking at the numbers or start trying to figure it out, you know, doing the job of what PPS and the analysts are supposed to be doing, right? Because yeah, I think bigger picture, I think we get too into the weeds or just too specifics when we get into these kind of conversations. And how do we zoom out a little bit more? That's just kind of a statement.
Thank you. Jennifer. There you go.
Similarly, just from an Atkinson perspective, at what point, I guess my comments and suggestions are going to depend if we stay co-located or not. So one of the things that I responded to a few coalition members and Jed is that I think we need to look at, if we're looking at staying with one strand of immersion at Atkinson, then we need to consider that threshold of 270 students to be in relation to our neighborhood strands. Does that make sense? Because we can't have, like, what has existed in our co-location is that some years we have 2 strands of neighborhood, some years we have 1 strand, some years we have to do blends, some years I'm wondering about how we can establish that minimum of 270 in a co-located program then needs to be for the neighborhood, or else we are going to continue to decrease and end up with a single strand, which is what we're trying to avoid.
Okay.
Well said, Jennifer. I wondered about that too, because the single strand, as we know, currently doesn't work. At least it's not as supportive as it can be. So if we're going to have the co-location at Atkinson, it would make sense to have 2 strands. And I know that we can accommodate 4 strands of, like 2 of neighborhood and 2 of DLI. So what's the alternative?
Right. I mean, we have to have at least 2 strands of neighborhood. I understand that this keeping 1 strand of immersion, that has stable enrollment because of the lottery, but the neighborhood side does not. And I just was speaking with staffing this afternoon, and we're going to be looking at some really significant cuts for next year.
That's true.
So thinking if, long term, how do we ensure that our threshold, I guess, is adjusted if we're going to support co-location? It shouldn't be 270 for the whole school, right? It needs to be 270 for the neighborhood strand in order to maintain a robust program of 2 teachers per grade level. Or else we're just going to end up in the same boat that Bridger has been in probably next year.
Okay, I see in the chat that there's some concern about middle school and Harrison Park. Let's hold that conversation from out of the chat. I want to get that in the room, but let's talk about this Atkinson thing first, and then we'll go right into the conversation y'all are having in the chat about Harrison Park. So Beth and then Harmony.
Yeah, I'm hearing what the concern that Jennifer's pointing out, and I was noticing in looking at the numbers earlier that that's an issue in a lot of these co-located programs. Clark is at 250 in the neighborhood strands. Woodstock is, I think, at 222 in the neighborhood strands. And then the issue is we have all of these neighborhood only programs that are also like hovering right at or under 270 also, without the additional resources that come from having that DLI strand in the building as well. So, I mean, one of the concerns that I have in general is do we have enough kids for all of these K-5 schools to have over 270 students in their neighborhood programs? I don't know. So I have stuff to say on the other topic too, but I'll come back to me on that later.
Yeah. Harmony.
Yeah, I think just echoing that point, I don't mean to open up a can of worms about creative science at Bridger, but I think there's a conversation to be had about when you look at the downstream consequences of putting a focus option lottery school at Bridger, which is this giant chunk of 300 to 400 kids, when you can't really distribute, what we need really is that chunk of kids more centered around where all the K to 8s were, in terms of having enough students to make, you know, stable, robust enrollment in our elementary schools. I'll tell you, these questions, this issue that Jennifer raises is exactly what my second grader has experienced every year. In kindergarten, we had tiny classes, 14 and 15, two kindergarten classes of 14 and a 15. They combined, we had a 129 kid first grade class. So second grade, we split again. We have a 17 and a 16 right now, very tiny, right? Which on the one hand, good for social distancing in a COVID year, but we're likely to see a single class of 33 next year. And this constant up and down is difficult for kids, but for teachers especially, and for like the culture of a school, that instability of either teachers having to move between grades, but also teachers leaving schools, having to hire and let go of teachers every year. We're already experiencing with a very small neighborhood boundary, and we're talking about expanding that issue across the Southeast region. And I'm just very concerned, and I'm struggling to see how to solve that problem with the number of kids we have. And I felt like maybe creative science moved more centrally might get us closer. But you know, we're hearing from the community. So I'm open to other suggestions about how to solve that problem.
Judy, is there anything you want to bring to bear here or no?
I mean, I think it's a great harmony when we were trying to do the modeling. Creative science in a different location for South allows a distribution of neighborhood students that can support nearby schools. The other thing I'm going to say is,
Judy, you're breaking up.
Yeah, maybe turn your video off, Judy. Try that.
yeah, just keep taking notes.
Okay.
Miro is overwhelming my computer.
Yeah, that'll do it. Okay, Marissa.
Yeah, thanks. I definitely really appreciated hearing what Dee and Adriel and Dr. O had to say about, you know, and like Dee said in the chat, it's like this game of which BIPOC community we're talking about, you know, in any given moment. And it's like you can present arguments for any, you know, in various ways all the time, right? So, I mean, my thought is like Leah Harrison Park's principal and I had a good discussion about like Harrison Park. What Harrison Park needs is, you know, we have a culture and community that is really working for our diverse communities, and people like any school don't really want that aspect to change. But what our students need is the resources that enrollment will bring. We need like the improvement in the facilities that inspires kids to feel like they're valued and are working, you know, toward their goals academically. Like, I mean, so we need the resources of adequate enrollment. And so that I think is a priority. And we also have the highest percentage of Black and Indigenous students in the Southeast. So to me, that's still, it's not about just talking about numbers, but it's like the numbers really do get the benefits that our students need. So, I'm really struggling with, I mean, having Mandarin DLI at Kellogg and Spanish at Harrison Park is not an outcome I ever imagined from this process, but it's like now being where we are, I'm really struggling with those numbers, with the issue of neighborhood programs moving from Kellogg to have Spanish GLI all be located there. So, I mean, yeah, it's possible we can, and again, like Beth mentioned in the chat, I think we're really like, or Andy, like that E1 is really tight as far as giving Harrison Park adequate enrollment, or just like barely adequate. So I think there is a lot that needs to be adjusted to make that acceptable for Harrison Park's enrollment. So
So Harrison Park goes to 570 in E1. Is that right? I think that's right, right? Okay. So
right, but then there, you know, we're assuming that like that includes all, you know, Woodstock's DLI students all moving, and I think there are a lot of ifs about that.
right. Okay, so let's have the conversation about Harrison Park and what program. I think that's Beth, where you were going to. Is there anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak yet who wants to talk about either the K-5 implication or the middle school implication of these programs? I'm going to open that up before we go back to anyone else. So if you're in, Josh, you haven't had a chance to speak yet.
Oh, the first time anyone's ever said that. I would say that after some impassioned speeches today and really reflecting away from the numbers, I'm finding it really hard to accept that we would move Spanish out of Kellogg. I kind of feel like that decision was almost taken from us, but that's where it is, and we just need to accept it and move forward. And it makes absolute sense for Mandarin in the Jade District for supporting their community at Harrison Park. So those things do make sense to me, and I do want to lean back on the community's desires. You know, Carmen gave us a very swaying speech in our last little quad group for what's happening at Lent and what is happening to these communities. And so just kind of following back on, you know, kind of what Oscar said in the beginning of, it seems like some of these decisions aren't really decisions we can make. Like the harm of moving Spanish out of Kellogg is going to be greater than wherever it lands, you know, because it'll have to be rebuilt, that type of thing. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what you were, because kind of what you were getting at in the conversation in the chat, I think between Andy and, or among Andy and Dee was, you know, are there ways that we can figure out the numbers if we say we're going to move Harrison or Spanish DLI to Kellogg, right? Like, are there guardrails, to use the term that Oscar used earlier, that we want to center first and foremost? So let's have that conversation.
Well, and so one final note on that, and then I'll stop. Another aspect of that is that the end of phase one, against all recommendations, Creston was put into Kellogg, which is leading to part of this overpopulation problem. It kind of falls in line with, hey, you know, you guys, you can move Kellogg wherever you want, but we did just put a whole lot of investment in doing this where it doesn't make sense to move. That there are unintended guardrails that are in place that it's best to surface as much as we can.
Yeah, thanks, Josh.
Promises and whatnot.
All right, Beth, and then Dee.
Yeah, I really do want to think about our charge in this phase two, our role in phase two, to think about ensuring robust and balanced enrollment for Harrison Park and Lane Middle School to ensure equitable access to resources. And when I look at the two proposals, I see a much more balanced set of options in E2 that feels a lot more comfortable to me in terms of ensuring that Harrison Park will have a robust experience that doesn't rely on making sure all the Woodstock immersion families stay with the program, or there's room for, you know, population shifts, because 651 and 73% enrollment feels like a really good, robust, strong place for that middle school to start, where 573, like that makes me feel nervous. And then when I also look at the remaining parts of E1 and I see that Kellogg remains at 93%, and that's after moving Creston back out of that school, do we need to move Arleta or Marysville out as well? I look at Hosford, that's at 90% capacity. I see a lot of imbalance, and I feel like if I want to hear some brainstorming that, like, if we want to put a guardrail around Spanish being at Kellogg, what are the solutions that we can really believe will provide a strong and robust and more balanced experience for Harrison Park, as well as balancing enrollment across the region? This is another piece of our job, is balancing enrollment and ending up with some schools with, 400 students and others with 725. doesn't feel like we're sort of undoing all of the imbalance that has built up over the last 10 years. We're just shifting it into different places.
Okay. All right, thanks, Beth. So Dee and then Ellie, and I'm trying to kind of not necessarily limit what you have to say for any speaker, but if we can just be mindful of times, that way we can get as many speakers in here, that would be great. Thank you, Beth. All right, go ahead, Dee.
So I just want to challenge I was told, early on I'd addressed with Judy, how are we accounting for like deterioration in the numbers in these programs if they move? Because that's this idea like, oh, well, the threat is like, oh, no one's going to go. So what's the point of moving it? And she told me early on that just can't be a consideration in making thoughtful program placements. They have to be made not based on the motivations of existing students. And so, she had a good point. And in our community, we did not sort of encourage the idea of like, hey, let's take a poll and see who's going to come and who's not going to come, and use that as a tool for whether or not it'll be properly enrolled. So I would challenge this assumption of just, the attrition in the programs based on the placement. I would just challenge using that as a piece here in these factors. And, just kind of on the side note is that, again, like back to the numbers, like I'm a scientist by trade. So to not sort of like go off the numbers, it's like, I want a spreadsheet and I want to rank it and I want to let that be. And it's just hard though, when you invite people into a process with the promise of like, hey, tell us what you think, tell us what's best for you. And if you don't set guardrails for those communities that, hey, tell us what you think, but at the end of the day, it's really only going to matter, or even that, like we set these metrics, like 500 in each middle school, 270 in each middle school. And then to sort of like hit that and then second guess those numbers and sort of bemoan a decision after the fact, it doesn't make sense to me. Because we hit the metrics and now it's like we're raising the bar again. And that's exactly what these BIPOC communities constantly feel is like, just do this and it's going to be good for you. But then when you do that, it's like, oh, wait, but then there's this other thing. And so I just want to be careful about how we invite people into this process and what we do with that engagement once we get it.
Thanks, Dee. Ellie.
Yeah, I have a lot going on in my head here, and if it doesn't come out in an organized fashion,
Okay.
I'm doing my best.
No, I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just really wondering where the voice is here for the neighborhood BIPOC kids. There's plenty of them in the neighborhood programs. And where is their feedback? Have we gotten it? I don't think we have. They were not given the same platform to speak out about what's best for them and what they want. And I don't think that's right. I really understand the value of DLI and that they have more BIPOC students, but they also have this like very tight-knit community of parents who already have an element of privilege to them. I would say, they have more economic resources and they are more able to advocate for their best interests. The neighborhood BIPOC kids don't have that the same way. And coming from Marysville, I feel very passionately about this. We are a high BIPOC population, and we are low SES, and we are the population that we're also supposed to be serving here. And I think we all know that if Spanish stays at Kellogg, then a neighborhood school is going to have to go to Harrison Park. And I didn't word that well. It's not. Harrison Park is going to be a wonderful middle school. The location is not ideal. It's the location. It's not the population of the students there. It's not that there's the higher BIPOC population and that we don't want to see our students at that school. It's the location. It's north of Division. It's east of 82nd. There are several unsafe intersections that we'll have to cross to get there. Kellogg could be our neighborhood middle school. And I really see this process as the neighborhood students being considered secondhand.
Thank you, Ellie. Okay, Elizabeth?
I think I want to just bring up 2 points. One is I will own, I think the inspiration of it came from Oscar and like the grouping of 4 that we talked about. But I think when we're talking about creating equitable services for all students, location is a piece of the conversation, and then resources is the second piece. And I think that we haven't seen that through this process, what is going to be provided within the schools around services, and how are we addressing and supporting all the students, even if we move people around. I think that's just an important consideration, and looking at how we're balancing program delivery. And I said this in the Tabor PTA, but I think it's also bears here in all these kids are neighborhood kids. And I think different variations of this have been said before. So I think our task here, my task is to just make sure all the kids have a good shot at getting a good, reasonable access to good education. And the notion is we're making choices, and we're making choices about and how we make choices. And if we're centering the voices of kids who have not typically gotten the benefit of the resources, I think that was their original task around racial equity and social justice. And it might be uncomfortable, but I think we have to be okay with the fact that ultimately our job here is to make choices. And some people, the impacts of those choices will be different for different students.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Oscar, back to you. Actually, before we go back to Oscar, is there anyone else who hasn't had a chance to speak that would like to speak? Maybe Dr. O, I'm sure you've got some district position, and then we'll go to you, Oscar.
Yes, what I wanted to say is, first of all, thank you all for your input. It's well thought through, but I do want to also remind us that at the beginning of this program, what we were looking at was how we can better support our programs to ensure that our students receive the academic, that the academic needs of our students are met, and that we're able to also support our staff as they seek to provide strong instructional basis for all our students. So that's partly how this conversation came about, and we haven't deviated from that at all. I know that about 2-3 weeks ago, Suzanne did a presentation on the neighborhood impacts on the students that we have in our neighborhood programs. Well, we can't look at our neighborhood programs without looking at our DLI programs and vice versa. Our DLI programs right now are the ones that seem to be fledgling a little bit, because most of them, not all of them, most of them are single strand, and most of them, because of our design, do not necessarily maintain the student numbers as they matriculate through the grade levels. So there's even a greater impact as our students matriculate through the grade levels. So our goal here is to see how we can mitigate for that. Our goal is also to make sure that we figure out a way to provide the resources and the supports for students. We already know that when they're in a co-located environment, because resources are thin and spread thin over both programs, it's not necessarily helpful for our DLI program because they have the lower numbers. So if we consolidate them, which is again how we arrived at whole school DLI, we increase the chances and the opportunity to provide a very robust support system and language structure for all our students who are in that program. The same holds true for students in the neighborhood program. As a matter of fact, we did talk about if we have a DLI whole school model somewhere, then our neighborhood program should also be within close proximity so that the students who reside in that neighborhood don't necessarily have to go out of that neighborhood to be able to attend whichever program they choose to be in.
Thanks, Dr. O. And thank you, Oscar, for monitoring your airtime and elevating Alyssa. So Alyssa, you, and then we'll go to Oscar.
Thanks, Oscar. I didn't even know how to do that, so I realized it was done for me. I just have a quick clarifying question actually about what it takes to move the Mandarin program from Hosford and why it doesn't, is it, I guess I'm not sure, it's not built on the same level as Spanish is at Kellogg, or it doesn't seem like it, but I haven't heard anything about that. And I was wondering if anybody could speak about that.
Is Judy in the room?
She is, let's see if we can
And
hear
how's
her.
is my audio okay?
Yes, now it is.
Melissa, I'm not an expert in this area, but I think what I want to emphasize that came up maybe when Claire was speaking last week was not just what the process is for moving teachers, but also the support staff who are assigned to a school that may have been sort of, uniquely placed there because they can also support that language community. So the process will be that during the 22-23 school year staffing cycle, there will be positions that open up at a middle school and positions that leave Oxford if the program moves from Oxford. When those positions open up at the middle school, there'll be qualifications, there'll be people who apply to them. There's a whole order that's agreed upon with the bargaining group on how those decisions will be made and how teachers would be placed to fill those positions. It's not clear how many support positions. So I don't know how many Chinese speaking staff might be at Oxford who do multiple things, including supporting kids and families who are there for the Chinese immersion. But it's not as likely that support positions become available in the school when the program moves. What happened at Kellogg was the ability to make a brand new staff with a program in mind. And some of those intentional placements had to do with the fact that they were anticipating serving Spanish immersion. So it isn't, so I don't know if that makes sense, but it's that broader intentionality. It's a lot harder to pick out pieces as individual people and just move them because of the way the staffing process works. And I don't know if it would be as intensive with the move from Oxford.
I think that's what I understand the intentionality piece behind how people were brought together at Kellogg. I guess what I don't understand or don't have the historical perspective is really, was that same intentionality put into Hosford for Mandarin DLI, like back years ago? And maybe so many years have passed that now it's been watered down a little bit, for lack of a better way to describe it, I guess. But I was just more curious about that piece of it.
Thanks,
Well,
Lisa.
and I know that the Hartford principal is present in the meeting tonight. Maybe we can.
Yeah, we're gonna go to the Hosford principal, Judy, because we can't hear you at all. You're breaking up now.
I was just gonna clarify, we have 2.5 teachers that would be going with the program, and we don't have any support staff that specifically support the Mandarin DLI program at the school. And just the other thing I'd highlight about Hosford is there's part of our boundary that isn't being considered with SEGC. So it's like there's a large neighborhood footprint, and the northern boundary of which is north of 84. So it's like we have a significant neighborhood population, kind of no matter what scenario you look at, even including parts that's not being considered in the process.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, we're gonna go to Oscar, and then Carmen, you don't have your hand up, but you're being voluntold. So if you'd be willing to talk, please raise your hand and you'll go after Oscar. Okay, Oscar.
Yeah, I mentioned this in our group, the duo and the quad. I'd like to see if we could get a better definition as to what robust middle school curriculum or school looks like, just because people keep talking about that, but without letting us know really what that means, right? So, I know of middle schools that are, preparing students for high school with extra math classes, algebra 1, 2, geometry, or, their language program is just really good that they're able to get all 4 years of Spanish or whatever language, Japanese or, so I'd like to, because I think that's what's missing in all of this, because okay, Harrison is going to get this. These are the programs they're going to have that is equal to or better than these schools, right? And if we could understand that, I think there'd be much more buy-in as opposed to like, oh, I don't want to leave this beautiful brand new Kellogg school and go to this Harrison Park, which we don't even know, hasn't been remodeled yet. So we don't know what it looks like. How pretty is it going to be? You know, so I think that would definitely help and put people at ease. At least it put me at ease. And then the other thing is, you know, having all this, the Spanish DLI at Kellogg, then, you know, we start talking about Franklin, right? What are they going to be offering at Franklin now that kind of keeps that DLI program strong at the high school level? So thank you.
Esther, do you want to take some of that on?
Yes. So thank you very much, Mr. Oscar, for your comments. I do want to say that a robust middle school program would have the core subjects, you know, the traditional ones that we offer everywhere: math, language arts, social studies, and science. Now, within that context, we do have the option of creating an accelerated math program for the students who are ready. So that is an option that they have available to them. The other thing that we do have for a robust program is that there will be electives for the students. Of course, they have to take physical education, and then there will be the electives, which could be language offerings, or it could be technology offerings like Project Lead the Way, for example, or it could be some other offerings that might have pathways into the high schools that they will be attending. So when we talk about a robust middle school program, we're talking about the core program, and then we're talking about the elective offerings and the ability for all language offerings and the ability for the student to continue that pathway through high school, and sometimes even throughout the career options that they want.
Okay.
Dr. O, would you also include test scores as part of that as well? Because I would consider that as well.
So test scores are part of that. So for example, in order for the students to be in the accelerated math program, which is the Algebra 1, Algebra 2 that you just talked about, they do have to have a minimum test score that is determined by the district, the program, and based on the standards that ODE does require that students attain. So yes, test scores is part of that. Part of the robust program also includes providing interventions for those students who are falling behind or are struggling, or finding other modalities to instruct them so that they are successful. We have a lot of our students who are visual learners. That's one area that we don't necessarily cater to, but which we're encouraging teachers to explore more, because less students are auditory learners, even though that's our preferred mode of instructional delivery practice. So yes, it does include test scores.
Thank you, Dr. O. All right, I promised I would never do this, but I am seeing a lot of requests for Carmen, and I don't know, I just want to put it out there, Carmen, to just open it. There you go. All right, let us hear from you.
First of all, I have to say, if my connection's bad, I'm out of Oregon. I'm 4 hours ahead of you, so it's midnight here.
No, thank you for joining us.
Yes, of course. I want to say I've been at Lent. Not everybody knows I've been at Lent for almost 20 years, but I am a parent as well. I am a DLI parent. I have a student who went through the K-8 model. He's a freshman. I have a student at Kellogg, and then I have a student still at Lent. So I have a full now experience of all of that. Just to share a little bit about what I've been talking about, you know, I am going to say I am really surprised that this is back on the table. I left and I was on a plane last Thursday, so I couldn't come to the meeting. I was informed by my principal that things changed and that Lent was being considered back again to of being a full DLI. So I'm a little frustrated with the situation just because I felt like the last meeting and the last conversations went a little bit different. And it feels like Lent always gets the shortest end of the stick. And when they're not at the table, it is the majority of what everybody else says. And that has been the history at Lent, is that we are community voices and we're not heard. So I know I've spoken to parents, both DLI parents who do not want to be a full DLI school, immersion and non-immersion staff who say they don't want to be a full DLI. The changes that we've had over the last 5-6 years. I mean, Richard is here, he knows. We've had these conversations, he was our principal before, of all the changing of admin. The history at Lent has been that all the admin that we have had before Richard, the last, I would say, 3 or 4 in admin positions are no longer with PPS. It's always feels like we get the leftovers. We get the admin that get left that are in some sort of trouble in another school, and they somehow always get placed at Lent. So I feel like one of the strengths of our community is our community, and separating our community is a big blow and a big almost slap in the face. Just because my biggest concern, and I mentioned this in one of the other groups, is a lot of the things that communities of color or low SES schools get told is in order for you to be successful, you have to leave your community. In order for you to be able to succeed, which to me says you have to forget who your identity and forget where you come from and forget all these things that make you who you are, and you have to leave in order to succeed. And a lot of people that aren't from these type of communities don't understand that. And I feel like that's what we're telling our kids and our community is in order for you to get the resources that you need and everything that you need, you have to leave your community in order to get that. And I feel like our kids get told that all the time, that, oh, things would be better. It's very difficult to have a conversation with a student who doesn't see the beauty within their own community, that you have to remind them that you have to bring in the beauty into the community garden and all these other things. And now you're telling them, after we've strived and worked for so many years to try to create this beautiful community, that now they have to leave this community. And not to mention the grandparents and all the and people that are helping the parents of our students that walk the kids to school of multiple cultures, and you're breaking up the diverse culture by bringing in a DLI. While I know that it would benefit my child because my child is still there, I know that it would do them good in numbers and statistics, but I really have a pushback on, we only look at what the numbers say and what the statistics say, and we're not really, and the strength of a community is unmeasurable. The way that a community is able to overcome so many things is unmeasurable. I can tell you so many different stories. I have lost students to suicide, to the jail system, to young death, to gun violence, and students that I have seen that were my students that are now on the street, living on the street, who have kids at my school who they have to see this. So there's so many different aspects, and now you want to break all of this apart. And the only thing and constant for this community, which I could say has gone on over the past 20 years, because I have students that were students at Lent and that now have students at Lent, or now parents at Lent too, that one consistent thing has been the school building. I mean, that's part of what the SUN model is, right? School United Neighborhoods, the school becomes the hub of the community. That is what we have strived for. And, we have staff for those that haven't been, Richard and other people that have been in our building can know that most of our staff, I would say a high percentage of our staff are there because they want to be there. And so it's very difficult to find staff that have so much time and commitment to serve the community and that want to be within a population and feel that their aspirations as teachers and educators, they can fulfill in a place like this. And so I sound very passionate right now. I know.
No, I appreciate that.
But it really is, I'm really frustrated with just how things are coming across right now. And I was asked in another group, can parents and staff support me? And so, yeah, that's the next step. That has also been the challenge because it's COVID times. We're not seeing the parents, and then the next part is that we've asked parents to come to the table multiple times for every admin, for every situation happening in the community. And they come and they express, but then they're not heard. They don't feel heard. So there's a lack of trust within the community, specifically with PPS. And I can name off all the reasons why that I don't need to name off right now, but I feel like people are not being heard. Our community isn't being heard. And it's just kind of, we're basing it off of just numbers, which I understand as a person who's worked in education for such a long time that is important, but that isn't, for me, that isn't the everything.
Thank you, Carmen. Yeah, thank you. So one question before you leave, because I think this is important, is, let me see. The question is, I'm curious if you would clarify on how you feel expanding DLI in the school to a whole school model would negatively impact the community. I think what you said is because it's forcing the community, it's forcing folks to have to leave the community to allow that program to come in. Is that right, Carmen?
Yes, and today I spoke to one of our DLI parents, and she says, while I know as a middle class parent would benefit for my student to be in a full DLI model, they're also, because we're middle class family, but it also affects his ability to experience a diverse community, because you are taking the diversity out of our school. For example, our leadership group has multi-racial, and a lot of the kids that are in our Lent leaders group are from the neighborhood side. So we've created a community there where we have immersion teachers and neighborhood teachers working together, and so she says that while she would appreciate again the DLI, it takes away the diversity from our community, because that's part of what makes Lent such a beautiful place, is the diversity. So that's why it doesn't benefit, why I feel that it doesn't benefit.
Thanks. And I think Beth is saying she's got a clarifying question for you. She's got her hand up. Go ahead, Beth.
Yeah, and it's partially for Carmen and partially for staff too, that with the model that is proposed in E1 and E2, Lent neighborhood would remain as part of a whole school DLI program. And so when you're talking about about people having to leave the community, that's so important. You're talking about students who where the DLI program, they would opt out of the DLI program?
I mean, I don't know if that would be the case, but it's also pushing out our neighborhood kids. Like walking from a 5-minute distance over the overpass and the low-income housing that's there, it's half neighborhood, half immersion. There's a lot of a mix.
But I want to clarify that these proposals are, the neighborhood boundary stays intact.
Yeah, but there's kids that are in the neighborhood program that are in the neighborhood that wouldn't stay at Lent if we become a full immersion. I'm talking about the neighborhood side of the English side.
Okay,
that's what we're losing, right?
So you're saying that those folks who would opt out of being part of that whole school neighborhood.
Well, no, it's actually, they're not opting out if they're being pushed out. So I wouldn't say that the option, to me, opt out would be like the option to be out. They're being pushed out if you're making the school a full DLI school.
So that's my follow-up question, which is to staff, is if Lent became full DLI, would it be phased in over time so those existing neighborhood students would remain at Lent, and it would be the incoming students where it's all DLI for the neighborhood? Or would it immediately go to all DLI and those current neighborhood students who are not in DLI would have to go somewhere else?
My understanding is that it would be phased in or phased out, however you want to explain it. But yes, it will be.
I agree. Those are important details. They'd have to be worked out. But I also think, Carmen would know that some families are going to have incoming students who won't stay, and they may wind up being split. New families who move into the neighborhood at upper grades who don't have Spanish background have to go elsewhere. So I think that's the long-term issue of kids who are closer to the school,
not going to the school, not just the students who are there now. Carmen, is that? Yes, she's nodding.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's all really valuable perspective.
Thanks, Beth.
Make sure we're on the same page.
Oscar.
Just to clarify, there's no option out there that would keep Atkinson co-located and Lent co-located, correct? Because it sounds like Lent wants to stay as is, and then Atkinson wants to stay as is, and Bridgers, we're going to be moving somewhere. or, in some of these options. And I think part of PPS's strategy is to have 2 locations or 1 versus 3. So something's got to give, and I just want to call it out there that that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out, and it's hard when everybody loves their neighborhood and wants to keep it as is. And how do we?
Well, I think you're exactly right, Scott. And so that's where I want to take us to, right? Is given everything you've heard tonight, what are some solutions that you can bring to this to start to address what we've heard? We've got, between A through E and every derivative thereof, a variety of options out there that we have dismissed up until this point. So what can we bring? Where can we get consensus? Like, where are guardrails that we can agree around? Philip.
Hey there. So it looks like to me in proposal E, we get 3 strands.
E1 or E2?
E2, I'm sorry.
Uh-huh.
We get 3 strands at Lent and 1 strand at Atkinson. Is that correct? And feeding to Harrison Park, right? So in an answer to your question, it sounds like those schools at Lent and Atkinson get to stay as they are with the intention of moving to Harrison Park. So like that's my curiosity on the elementary side. I know then the problem becomes folks really want to keep Spanish at Kellogg. And so that becomes the complication. But we did see in E2 that the numbers balance out. They balance out cleaner in the E2 model. We have less larger, those large disparities that existed in E1 are somewhat remedied. So I'm curious how folks are feeling about the E2 side.
I think that's a good question. I got a gut check on Beth's. So sorry. And it's a little bit different than the question that you're asking, right? So are there suggestions for creating a better balance across middle schools in E1, or are people comfortable with the enrollment levels as they are in E1? So I'm going to put that one aside for a minute. Does anyone want to speak to what Philip is talking about, which is looking at E2 and trying to use that as a, I don't know, starting point? I don't know if that's necessarily the word that you would use, Philip, but okay. D.
In that vein, I guess I would encourage us to consider, as we're looking at these proposals, like nothing has ever been applied perfectly in any scenario. And Beth had a really good point that this is our chance to get it right in this scenario. But I also want to consider that sort of getting it right with 100% acuity is sort of it's disregarding what people want. And so I feel like if we can get close and figure out a way to find some equity in the process and fit the goals, that I think the rest of it has to be up to sort of district and district staff to sort through all this stuff.
Thanks, you. Eddie, and then I'll go to you, Esther.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, I don't know if I'm ready to comment yet, but yeah, I just want to point out, this affects my family personally, because we're looking at possibly going to Harrison Park, which I'm totally fine. The distance from Woodstock to Harrison Park or Hosford are almost pretty similar, but if it's running the risk of Harrison Park possibly being under enrolled, then that becomes an issue of what about the Woodstock community? And there's the other thing I was pointing out in our breakout room is that there's what Dee said earlier about going to a school where people look like you and how I grew up in a school that a lot of people didn't look like me, and the microaggressions that were happening were pretty harmful. There's a lot of people that aren't represented here. I just want to throw that out there. For example, Woodstock, we have a lot of biracial kids, and they don't reflect in the numbers of native speaker. But I understand the goals of immersion programs is, to help emergent language speakers, but there's also other things that people are also benefiting from, especially in minority populations. But yeah, I just want to point out, I think I need to talk about the issues with the numbers of Harrison Park in E1 before I can feel comfortable going with that.
Okay. Before we go circle back to Esther and Oscar, actually, I'm going to go ahead and let you speak up, Esther, because I think you're going to answer a question. And then before we go to Oscar, I want to invite anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak to raise your hand. Go ahead, Esther.
So what I wanted to just say is that this is by no means a perfect process. And because it's not a perfect process, it's the reason that we looked at our rationale for engaging in it to begin with, which is to increase student academic achievement and to ensure that when our students leave our DLI programs, they are biliterate and they are bilingual. So that said, in order for us to be able to provide the conditions that will allow our students to graduate with those skills under their belt, it is necessary for us to look at numbers, because numbers bring resources, and resources, well utilized, provide the support for both staff and students in the program. So while I hear concerns about who's in what program and what the numbers are and who's going to be excluded and so on, the ultimate goal for us is to increase student academic achievement and to make sure that as we do that, our students are supported and our staff members are supported as well, and the resources are adequate. Our programs right now, for most of them, have very thinly spread out resources. And if we continue that way, then we're not going to benefit or attain our ultimate goal. So I just want to put that out there to say, yes, I hear all this other conversation about numbers, who's affected, who's impacted, how we need to move. The ultimate rationale for this process is student academic achievement. So let's always just circle back to that to say, at the core of it is that, how do we get there? We need numbers. Where do the numbers come from? And I also hear a lot about DLI and it being exclusionary for some people. It really isn't. A DLI program is just that. It is open to everybody. Whoever wants to enroll in it, regardless of race, creed, religion, belief, is welcome in a DLI program. So you really don't lose out on the immersion. You actually benefit because the diversity is still immersed or part of that DLI program if it is managed correctly.
Thanks, Dr. O. Okay, I feel like to get us to closure, we're going to have to take some pulse polls, for lack of a better term, right? So to get an idea of where we are, but I'm struggling to figure out what those should be, because originally I was thinking like do a hand raise or the E1 or E2 in the chat. But given what Carmen has raised, I don't know if that's the right way to go. So let me think. Let's just play this out. So I see your hand up. I see continued. Esther, I'm going to put your hand down because I think you just spoke. Andy and Oscar, I see your hand up, but I'm worried that we're just cycling because people are just digging in at this point, right? And so I'm trying to get us to move through that. And so I know these choices aren't going to be perfect, and we can talk about some other choices that people want us to kind of to consider. But can we do my preference is for E1 as a starting point or E2 as a starting point, just to start. So again, just in the chat, put E1 or E2. Yes, as a middle school placement only. Let's think about that as a middle school placement only. And then we'll talk about K5 in a minute. So basically, E1 or E2 middle school only, which is E1 is middle school. What is it? Oh, it's Chinese DLI to Harrison Park and Spanish DLI to Kellogg, and the inverse in E2.
So what's the priority? Equity or count or robust?
Whatever
Okay,
you
square
think.
one.
I mean, I think the district is saying we'd like equity to be, the highlighting BIPOC, Native, and ELL families. I think you've had different people make different arguments for what is equity in that regard. So I would say view that in whatever context you can, until, and give me your best guess at that.
I think that's we got to be careful about that being a false dichotomy there between equity and numbers.
I agree. That's what I'm saying. So I think people have talked about equity in a variety of ways. So however you define equity. Okay. So maybe that's not fair. So I think everyone is saying we prefer E1 if we can fix the issues. I think that's consistent, right? So let's talk about how we fix the issues.
Maybe we should highlight the issues first. So are they highlighted somewhere?
I think the issues is enrollment.
Elstree and
Can you
Harrison
put
Park
the
and
slide
Kellogg, I
up
think.
that shows, can you show the picture, like the graphic slide that shows,
which one?
so we can see, like the one from the slideshow that showed percentages,
this guy?
like where it was over, where it was under, not that one.
No, like the feeder,
like the
I
graphic.
think this is the
this
one.
graphic, but with the percentages from the slideshow.
I'm sure.
It has,
Feeder graphic.
Yeah, the school
it
by
has the
school.
schools in it. Like there's
Yep,
a middle
yep,
school in the
yep.
middle. Perfect. Thank you.
I'm looking.
Yeah, there we go. You're
Right
on
there,
I
on
saw
the far left or far
For
right.
E1 or E2? We're going to start with E1, right?
E1.
Okay, here we go.
I mean, so the issue is Kellogg is very overcrowded, even after having removed Creston as a feeder. And Harrison Park, as Marissa mentioned, is you know, I mean, it's over the 500, but it's a little precarious. And in a perfect world, you'd be able to address both of those things, since they both have potentially negative consequences for students. And I think to piggyback on what I was going to say when I had my hand raised was, the only thing I can come up with that addresses both of those is what Ellie mentioned, I think, which is, well, you'd move Marysville from Kellogg to Harrison Park, but it's pretty tough.
Okay, I'm getting us a Flow representative because I think between Flo and Judy, they're probably the only ones that can help us.
I'm also a little confused where the 724 number is coming from. Currently at Kellogg, we're slightly below 700. If you added the DLI from Tabor and subtracted out Creston, that would be a net loss.
You're
So-
also adding the Lent neighborhood as part of that Lent DLI.
That's
Exactly.
But Lent's already with us.
Oh, yeah.
Like currently Lent is with us. So I'm just confused on why that number is so high.
Okay.
In
Getting
D1, it was at 678, which was basically the same thing, only, yeah. So I don't know why it's different. Just, I mean, because these are a 5-year forecast, I think is why.
So one thing to keep in mind is that we have looked at configurations where Lent immersion and Lent neighborhood did not go together, and it was to try and balance enrollment. So, and I've got a feeling that that would not be maybe acceptable within the Lent community, but that is one thing that was on the table before, and that is that immersion would go where the rest of the immersion is, but neighborhood, say, would go to Harrison Park. It also looks like we're looking at about, what, 75 students? Like if it was, there's a difference of about 150 students with these counts. So if 75 students were at Harrison Park instead of Kellogg, they'd have like the exact same enrollment, about 650. I don't know that there's 75 students between those two schools that we can artfully carve, but just to give you a framework for where you would get even, and I don't know that that's even the only goal. Andy, what do you mean by largest in the smallest?
Isn't Kellogg the smallest capacity of the ones? I mean, I'm exaggerating.
No. The smallest
The ones we're considering
capacities are Mount Tabor and Hofstra.
Oh, well, okay, but right. I mean, sorry, maybe I meant of the available realistic.
I see some new names, so I want to bring those to light. Regina.
Hi, so I was wondering with this configuration, if we're saying that we have to move a neighborhood school out of Kellogg, would that present, again, like some challenges in terms of, I mean, I know because I've been in a middle school, I've been a middle school admin in terms of scheduling and then like tracking, because then you have, I mean, then the neighborhood students, you know, it's like you have fewer of those students and you have an overwhelming number of DLI. And so I'm just wondering if that, you know, again, is something to think about as well. And then I also see it as an unfortunate, you know, that not more neighborhood schools can attend such a geographically central middle school. So I think that's another trade-off when we think about this configuration comparatively to, let's say, E2. Just things that I'm like weighing. I mean, I think there's, you know, there's again, pluses and negatives to each proposal.
Okay, so we have Jed Jed has joined us. So Jed, one of the sticking points is, and I don't think this is true for 100% of the people, but a lot of people are interested in E1, but concerned about the enrollment in at Kellogg.
Yeah.
Right. So are there ways to, with boundaries or through any other means, address that concern?
Yep. So we need to look at Marysville and Arleta, right? Those are two schools that could come out of Kellogg and feed elsewhere, right? And so when we think about Marysville, probably the closest other middle school there that would make the most sense is Harrison Park. And for Arleta, the closest would be Lane to the south. Now with both of those attendance areas, right now they're very north-south. So they would need to be pretty significantly reoriented to have that feeder pattern fit. So if we take Arleta as an example, and Marysville would be a big part of this change. If, for instance, Arleta's attendance area was all south of Foster and then feeding to Lane. That's a way that reorientation could work to help also move some more enrollment into Lane and potentially reduce the need for Lewis feeding into Lane and able to move that back to Selwood to get it back over 500. So there could be some cascading effects there. But of course, you know, that's another situation kind of similar to what we've heard with, you know, Spanish DLI and a neighborhood program at Arleta that just got going at Kellogg. So, you know, a painful move there. Likewise with Marysville. I think with Marysville, what we see is probably more challenges around getting across major streets, right, to get up to Harrison Park, you know, big crossings for, you know, 82nd Division, Powell. So those are some of the considerations there, and also just very big boundary changes to make that happen.
Questions? Let's see. Philip, do you have your hand up still from last time, or is this a new hand? Okay. Regina, how about you? New hand or further questions? Okay. Harmony.
I have two questions.
Okay.
Or two comments, questions. So with only Glencoe at Mount Tabor with the Japanese immersion, is there a limit to, is there a schedule limitation there, like we've talked about having, you know, like a single strand of, like, because the Japanese program is so big, is the Glencoe big enough to balance it, or are we limiting the options for the neighborhood, the non-DLI kids at Mount Tabor, especially when it's under 500, is one question. And the second point I'll just raise is that in the current, in both of the E proposals, there are very few kids who live around Kellogg who will go to Kellogg. if any. It's the handful that are in the DLI program and or who happen. And I just want to surface that issue. If when we talk about proximity or walkability or any of those issues, we aren't the kids who live near Kellogg aren't going to Kellogg. In really in most of the scenarios we've looked at, and maybe that's a trade-off that we make, but I think it's something to consider. So
if the draw for the neighborhood is from a feeder school, how is that? I really am I'm struggling with that interpretation of placing a program there, because the kids who would be in the DLI program would be coming from that neighborhood school, and that's the point of moving it.
Sometimes.
What do you mean by sometimes?
Except that the
But no,
boundary.
go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was say it's not always true, right? Like where the lottery comes from isn't necessarily within the neighborhood boundary. So there's a small proportion, right, that lottery's in for those spots. But there's a giant chunk of kids from that live in the neighborhood around Kellogg that won't go there. It's I'm just surfacing it. It might be a fine trade-off.
Okay.
I think that was surfaced probably 5 years ago when it already was decided, right, that Kellogg would be a Spanish DLI school, and nobody's getting anything taken away. It's just keeping it as is. So I don't understand why people keep talking about as if stuff is being taken away from neighborhood students, or that they're not going to go to their neighborhood school, since it's already been established years ago, right, before the remodel and things like that. So it just seems hard to hear right now.
That's not
okay,
information that was ever shared with us. If that was
Yeah, that wasn't.
helpful to know.
Okay, so I want to give Sandra an opportunity to speak. She hasn't had a chance to speak, and then I want to get us closer to trying to figure out how we can an escape plan, if you will, how we can get some consensus. Go ahead, Sandra.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
My blood pressure just went up a little bit. I'm trying to. So in response to Oscar's statement, I'm not sure where you got the information that this process happened 5 years ago, that it was decided that the Spanish program was at Kellogg right now, or B, that was a stated outcome of this process so far. In that, I mean, we heard pretty clearly through our outreach and feedback in phase 1 that the desire was to see Kellogg opened as a school that's going to be primarily serving neighborhood programs. And there was a lot of concern that if too many focus or other programs were put into Kellogg, that end result would be what we were just talking about, seeing neighborhood schools pushed out, having a school that's more centrally located to all of these feeder schools, be a majority non-neighborhood students. So the kids going, living around there aren't actually able to attend the school. So I think we were all a little bit shocked to hear that there was an assumption that it had been established that Kellogg would have the Spanish DLI program cited there. What I had said in our quad earlier is that this whole process has had me really tied up, because of course we want to create the perfect hiring for every program. We want to see that happen all of the time. We want to have the best principal, the best staff for a school. But I also have to ask myself, if we hadn't divided this process into 2 phases, if we had kept this process as 1 phase and we opened Harrison Park and Kellogg at the same time, what would our choices have looked like then? Now I realize, of course, we have to deal with reality. That didn't happen, and now we have something else sitting in our lap. But I think that we also need to just take that into context as well, that there's a lot more at play here than there's just a program already cited there, because that was explicitly not the intent of the SEGC in phase one. And if someone else had a different impression, please feel free to correct me. Of course, I'm only one person.
Okay, so just from a logistical standpoint, the other room is kind of gone as far as they can go. They need to hear from us. And I know that there's a lot of stuff going on in chat, a lot of stuff going on still to talk about. So I'm going to suggest that they close us now and bring us back together, and then we will bring the other group up to speed. We'll talk about what the concerns are and then see where we go with the larger group. All right, we'll see you back in the main room.